Dr. Baroud. The time is yours. You can start your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabriela, for the nice introduction. Unfortunately, I do not speak Spanish, but I aspire to learn the language. I have been to Guatemala once before. It was right before the pandemic started in 2020, and I hope to return soon because I really enjoyed my visit, and hopefully that will help me to learn a little more the language. What I'm going to talk about today is describe kind of the research perspective that we take when we think about disaster management and disaster response, which is an interdisciplinary research and also explains the different departments that are listed under my name. So my work is interdisciplinary, and I do a lot of collaborations with people from different backgrounds and also from different countries. You'll hear about one of these collaborations by the presentation by my colleague, Luis Gonzalez, in the next set of presentations. I was instructed to speak slowly because I think there's a translation happening at the same time, I believe, as I'm talking. So in case I usually talk very fast, in case I go a little faster, please feel free to nudge me and let me know to slow down. Okay, so if we think about, when we're thinking about planning or preparing for disasters in the future, we need to think about the cities that we live in. And if we think of them as kind of by definition as complex systems, we have a better or more comprehensive approach towards disaster preparedness. And when we think about these complex systems, those systems, think of them as a continuous interaction between infrastructure systems and people. And so infrastructure systems could be transportation, power, and water. And then people could be the users, the community, but also policymakers or decision makers who operate and maintain these infrastructures. And when I talk about cities, I don't necessarily mean big urban areas only, but also this applies to small rural areas. So there's always, by definition, the environment that we live in is a continuous interaction, complex interactions between people and infrastructure. And it's not only that, these interactions or these complex systems are adapting continuously to a changing environment. One of these changes are these disasters that we're witnessing every year. We're expected to adapt, respond to these disasters, recover, and then adapt to these changes. And when I refer to disasters, those are primarily in our work caused by natural hazards, but these could also be the result of a pandemic or cybersecurity attack and so on. But in this talk and in our research, we primarily focus on natural hazards. And so these events are often exacerbated and become worse by more slow onset changes or chronic stressors, like, for example, climate change and development, which further increase the frequency, but also the intensity of these disasters over time. And clearly, in Guatemala, you are not strangers to these types of patterns. In fact, I'm glad that an event like this one is organized and recognizing this extremely important topic, which has impacted Guatemala over the years. Those are just some few examples. I think I won't spend a lot of time on the last day of the conference motivating why we need to study disaster management, but I'll just say that these disasters in Guatemala specifically have impacted, every time they impact tens of thousands of people who are displaced. It impacts infrastructure and also a lot of times leads to multiple deaths. And interestingly, as I was preparing for this talk, I found out that one of the risk index reports, I think from 2017, ranked Guatemala fourth globally. So it was number 4 globally in terms of the risk of becoming a disaster victim or vulnerable to disasters due to an extreme natural event. Now, one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that I discussed earlier that disasters are becoming more frequent, and the fact that natural hazards and climate change is actually one of those reasons, but they're not the only reason why these disasters are becoming more frequent and more costly. One way to look at it is to understand the fact that these disasters, actually, a disaster occurs, it's because there's this interaction between the environment or the natural hazard, the infrastructure, and also social systems. So when these are interacting and as a result of the natural hazard, that could lead to a disaster. And so this increase in frequency and intensity is not only due to the natural hazards, it's due to the fact that we as people and our infrastructure, we are becoming more vulnerable. So there is something that we can do about it to mitigate the impact of these disasters in the future. So what exactly do we want to achieve in this case? Well, there's a lot that we want to do, but one way that I like to summarize it is using this photograph. So this photo was taken after Hurricane Ike in 2008 in Texas, but the house itself was built after Hurricane Rita in 2005. Sorry, I think I may have mixed the years. So the house was built after Hurricane Rita in 2005, and the photo was taken after Hurricane Ike in 2008, 3 years ago. So this area was hit by a hurricane, everything was destroyed and rebuilt. And then 3 years later, another hurricane hit, everything was destroyed except for that one house. And so basically what we want to achieve is to be like this house, meaning that we want to prepare for disasters in the future, for disasters that will happen in the future, and not only disasters that have happened in the past. And we termed this, we worked with colleagues in, I noticed that may not be very clear, but we term this as sustainable resilience, which is this ability to maintain the resilience over multiple generations and multiple systems into the future. And it's something that I worked with colleagues in my department a few years ago. So this is what we want to achieve. Well, the big question is, well, how do we achieve this? Like I said, we cannot just look at historical data to predict the future, because then these models are going to predict a similar pattern as what happened in the past, whereas in reality, the events that are happening in the future are much bigger and much more impactful than the events that have happened in the past. So one way to approach this is to acknowledge this interaction between these three systems: the infrastructure, the environment, and the people, or the social systems, and be able to characterize the fact that they are uncertain, that they change over time, and that there are complex interactions between those systems. And the approach that we take in my research is to model the uncertainty, the data, and the human piece whenever we take as a comprehensive approach when we are evaluating disaster mitigation, response, and recovery. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you a few examples from projects that have addressed each of these three aspects. It primarily focuses on the modeling approach that addresses uncertainty, data, and humans, but in terms of implementation and application, we actually have to consider all three of those. In our studies, we have been focusing on modeling aspects that evaluate each of those three when it comes to infrastructure and community resilience. So the first one looks at data. The first project, we develop methods and statistical models that help us use a lot of data to quantify risk and be able to prepare for disasters. So when we think of data in the context of disasters, we're dealing with a very diverse and heterogeneous set of data. So sometimes we might have big data which describes the daily operations of a system, which describes, sometimes we can mine data from social media, from, for example, if we're looking at the system's characteristics, we have a lot of data that is generated daily. Some of it is useful and some is not useful. And sometimes we deal with little data. So for example, when we're looking at historical disasters, these disasters are becoming more frequent, like I said, but they are still considered a rare occurrence. So they are very extreme and rare occurrence. So the sample size, when I look at historical data, historical disasters, is smaller than what typical statistical methods are need to provide accurate results. And then in some cases, I have no data. And so in these cases, for instance, when we're looking at post-disasters decisions or looking at how the system has recovered over time or lessons that we learned from these historical disasters and past decisions, there's rarely kind of a system or a way to collect this data and use it in order to learn for future disasters. And so a lot of times this data is not existing, but we have to somehow produce estimates or predictions without having the data that we actually need. So this is where sometimes some of the modeling approaches help us overcome these challenges. So in this project where we looked at data, this project is kind of focused on combining multiple data sets from different sources and using this historical data to predict the risk of infrastructure failure during disasters. And what we mean by infrastructure here, we focus on two types of infrastructure systems, the power systems and transportation systems. And why is that? It's because this is part of a bigger project that is led by the University of Houston with partners from the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston and our partner, which is the Houston Food Bank. And so the motivation behind this is that and during disasters, specifically during hurricanes and floods, but also any kind of other natural hazards that Texas and specifically Houston have been dealing with, the infrastructure failure has impacted the food distribution process. So the Houston Food Bank is one of the largest food banks in the US, and their decisions to distribute food during the disaster becomes more challenging because of the road closures. They need to know ahead of time where to actually reach the clients. And then because of the power outages, they have to decide which type of food to distribute that may not require heating, let's say, or a refrigerator, because these power outages could sometimes last for several days. So that their decision becomes more difficult. And one way to help with their decision, we actually organized a lot of workshops to better understand their challenges, was the fact that they do not have enough information on a timely basis. So every few hours to update their operations of how they will distribute the food during the hurricane. And so, and in addition to that, it's that the region itself, Houston, has the highest food insecurity rate in the country, and that actually food insecurity increased significantly during COVID. And the area, of course, like I mentioned, is vulnerable to hurricane storms and flooding. So our goal was, how can we find a way to provide information on a timely basis so that the Houston Food Bank can kind of update their decision making. And this is, again, in collaboration with our colleagues at University of Houston, who are also developing an optimization model that would help Houston Food Bank with their decisions. So our data or our prediction will be an input to that optimization model. And so the approach that we take is that we combine a lot of data on risk factors that would influence the likelihood that the power goes out or the likelihood that a certain road segment is not going to be accessible. And we combine all this data, and the goal is to develop this risk map that will provide stakeholders kind of an idea of where are the areas that have the highest risk of power outages, highest risk of road closures, or also highest risk of combined power outages and road closures, and use that map updated to make these decisions. So we took the approach of statistical learning methods to help us predict these risk indicators of infrastructure vulnerability, and we focus primarily on the predictive accuracy. So what we want to estimate this function f that relates a set of predictors x to our response variable y, and our response variable y here is either the likelihood that a road is closed, or it's the number of customers that don't have power. And so the goal is to focus on the ability of the model to predict new data sets. So it's not just focusing on historical data, but it's the ability of the model to predict future occurrences based on these historical values, but also accounting for the uncertainty that these events might change in the future. And so one of the approaches that we consider is the Bayesian additive regression trees, which I won't spend a lot of time here, but basically it combines kind of two main ideas in statistical learning, which is one of them is decision trees, which is it's an ensemble of small trees that we're combining, and then the Bayes theorem, which allows us to account for this uncertainty and be able to produce a probability distribution of our prediction instead of just 1 point estimate. So this allows us to consider a whole range of possible values that will happen in the future, as opposed to just estimating 1 point. So this is the output of the model. So like I said, we have this heat map, which shows us which areas have the highest risk. So the lighter colors, so the yellow here has the highest risk and the purple has the lowest risk. And on the right, you have a plot that shows the overall accuracy of the model with respect to the real data. So the points in black, this is the actual data. And then the red is the range of prediction that are produced by our model. And so it allows us to capture also some of the main risk factors. So this is, for example, the heat map on the top of the root zone mean. So this is looking at how deep the root zones are of the trees. And you can see that some of the shallower root zones on the top might have been contributing or correspond to this higher risk and power outages. So this also helps us identify potential strategies to mitigate some of these impacts. And then in the second step of the model, what we did is we considered dynamic forecasts. So this allows us to update this risk map over time as the hurricane is approaching the region. So this is one example. At the bottom, the small map shows you the track of the hurricane and how it's approaching Texas and Houston. And so we update this map once the hurricane has, for example, landed and reached Houston. And so we can make these updates based on these dynamic forecasts so that emergency responders and the Houston Food Bank can update also their decisions accordingly. So in a way, the data here, because we have a lot of data, we're able to make these predictions and update them over time. But sometimes we don't have all the data that we need, and we have quite a bit of uncertainty in our model that we need to account for. So one example is looking at the interdependencies between different infrastructure systems. So the previous project looked at the infrastructure systems separately, so the power and the transportation, how I gave you the results of the power system. But the reality is that these infrastructure systems do not operate separately. They are actually interconnected. And one example is actually the interconnection between the power system and the water system. And so energy and water are very interconnected during disasters, but also over long periods of time. And here we argue that sometimes these uncertainties between infrastructure systems could be driven by the uncertainty from social systems. So, for example, the decisions that we make about how much we use water, how much we use power, or maybe decisions that are made in terms of investing or preparing some of these systems for disasters, it might affect how power and water systems are interconnected. And so one way, for example, how they're interconnected is I need, for example, water to generate electricity, or in some cases, I need electricity to distribute water. And so one example that I like to give is the freezing weather that Texas had or Houston had a couple of years ago. Part of the kind of the failure or the widespread power outages was actually due to an interdependency between the power and the gas system, because it had been cold for several days and there was an increase in the demand for gas, which also affected the generation of electricity. But here for this specific project, we look at Shelby County in Tennessee. So this is where Memphis is. And the area is vulnerable to earthquakes, to storms, and to flooding. And so we wanted to kind of propose a way to capture the uncertainty and the interdependencies to account for things that are related, for example, to social vulnerability. And so why is this important? We focus on this interaction between social vulnerability and infrastructure because it helps us to consider things like equity when we're looking at disaster recovery. So, for example, if a utility is looking at ways to recover a lot of power outages that happened, should they prioritize, for instance, the restoration of a retirement home or maybe a critical facility like a hospital, depending on the resources, as opposed to recovering the power or restoring the power of facilities that are less critical, such as, I don't know, maybe like the dorm of university students or something like that. So the map here is showing kind of a heat map of the social vulnerability index. So that index is kind of an indicator that aggregates various socioeconomic metrics, like, for example, income, education level, and so on. So the darker colors are the more vulnerable people are in that area. And then it's overlaid with kind of the topology of the power and the water system. And so because we have information on the social vulnerability, what we did is we proposed a dynamic approach to update these interdependencies over time as a disaster is happening, and then update their ranking based on the social vulnerability, and use that to inform a dynamic restoration activity, as opposed to a static strategy where at the beginning you decide which are the most important components, and then you use that to propose a restoration strategy. And so the map here, the plot here on the right shows that the blue line is this dynamic restoration strategy that we propose, where at each point in time, the most important links are identified based on social vulnerability. And then the black line is the static ranking, which is typically the method that is used. And so interestingly enough, when we applied the dynamic approach, the overall resilience of the infrastructure was improved by 60%. And so you see that overall, there's less uncertainty around the resilience value, but also you reach the recovery, or you reach resilience equals to 1 faster than the black line or the static approach. Okay, now we've seen how data is important, how it's important to account for uncertainty by evaluating kind of the probability or the likelihood that infrastructure systems are interconnected. But the reality is that all these decisions in terms of designing, operating, and maintaining infrastructure are made by people. And so accounting for the human aspect is extremely important. And considering it as part of the modeling approach as opposed to two separate entities is important, especially during disaster management, because the emergency responders, they're all people, and the decisions that are made by people. So how do we account for that fact in our models so that our models are not just black boxes where I just input data and I get the results and that's it. So what we want to do here is we want to account for kind of how we can capture what's going on in the mind of the decision maker and incorporate it into our models. And so a lot of times this gets materialized in many examples, but one of kind of the most classical example is that you can have a lot of models and data, but at the end of the day, it will come down to the decision maker's preference or level of comfort with risk. So a lot of people might, for example, prefer to absorb a current loss to avoid a future risk, for example. And so how do we account for this trade-off when this trade-off actually is very different when we're considering different people and their own preferences and their values and so on. So this is one of kind of like a classic example, but a more extreme case is one, and actually in Sri Lanka, where we had a project that looked at planning for future energy systems. Now you might think, what does this have to do with disasters? But well, one of the disasters is the fact that being able to sustain energy for the future under climate hazards, like things like heat waves and increased demand, but also interactions with water and so on. So the interesting part in Sri Lanka is that the whole country has relied on hydropower generation until the early 2000s. But then recently they've had an increase of demand for both energy and water, so hydropower generation was no longer enough. But also there are a whole suite of other challenges with the country, especially now, but this work was done a couple of years ago. But the country has a lot of challenges that are social, economic, and political, and we need to account for all of these when it comes to making decisions related to expanding the energy infrastructure. So the diagram here is kind of our understanding or our kind of vision for how the decision is made in Sri Lanka, and this was based on a lot of interviews and surveys that we've done with stakeholders that interact with each other to plan for future energy systems. And so what I wanted to do is we want to kind of capture the diversity of different stakeholders in that decision and kind of find out what are the best ways or what are the best steps forward to plan for energy when you have different views and different preferences. So one approach that we took, the first one, is that we considered mainly decision analysis models. So at this stage, we don't have a direct contact with the stakeholder or the decision maker, but instead we first came up with different types of alternatives. So these alternatives are kind of the different rows in that figure here. So low emission, for example, is the most sustainable approach, whereas energy efficiency takes into account costs and so on. And then we considered multiple criteria related to the feasibility, the economic aspect, the uncertainty, social, and so on. And for each of those criteria, we had different attributes that allowed us to quantify how each of those alternatives will perform under each of these criteria. But we didn't stop there. We actually wanted to account for the preferences. So for example, maybe a stakeholder who is an environmental activist would be interested, would rate higher the environmental stewardship, for instance, as opposed to maybe someone from the utility company will be more concerned about the economic or the technical feasibility or technical flexibility of the alternative. So accounted for allowed the model to consider different weights for these different criteria, and then based on that, looked at the overall ranking of these alternatives. So at this stage, we consider 3 hypothetical stakeholders. So if someone is a regulator, what would they choose? And if someone is from a utility company or someone's from the environmental sector, what would they choose? And evidently, of course, there wasn't really a clear winner. Each of those stakeholder groups chose the method that works best for them. So we did not arrive in a way at an agreement by taking this approach. But what it allowed us to explore is that we did some sensitivity analysis where we changed the decision makers' weight, but also we changed the decision makers' weight and the overall performance of the alternative. And we found out that overall the energy security and energy mix alternatives have high potential for reaching an overall agreement among stakeholders. But overall, what this taught us is that the whole decision-making process is an iterative and adaptive planning approach that allows us to rank these alternatives based on input from stakeholders and their preferences. So what we did next is we actually went there and had a workshop called an envisioning workshop where we brought participants from different sectors, so planners, regulators, people from the environmental and social groups, and so on. And we still gave them these alternatives that we have developed. But in the first step, what we did is we combined or organized the workshop, the participants into groups, homogeneous groups. So everyone who was kind of in their own group, we gave them these different alternatives and asked them to rank them. And of course, the result was very similar to what we obtained when we did just the modeling approach. But then in the next step in the afternoon, what we did is we mixed them up in different groups. And so here the groups were heterogeneous. So we might have someone in the same group from the utility company, but also from financial sector and so on. And that session took a lot longer, of course, because it took much more time for people to arrive at a conclusion and decide together. But again, this allowed us to better understand and look at how, when we have communication between different stakeholders and understand their different priorities between sustainability and resilience, how that could help them achieve kind of a common ground. And in some of the groups, actually, what they did is they came back and they came up with their own alternative that was none of the ones that we proposed. So I can see that Gabriela is turning on her camera, so I will wrap up with some takeaway messages going back to where we started with thinking about resilience in terms of cities that are complex systems that are interacting between people and infrastructure and constantly adapting to change. We've seen from all these examples that we need transdisciplinary research to achieve disaster resilience. And there's quite a bit of trade-off between data and models. In my presentation, I primarily focused on models, but in some other cases, maybe we need to collect more data or different tools to improve our data collection. In closing, I want to acknowledge the work of my students and many collaborators on these projects and the financial support of the National Science Foundation for our work. Thank you again for listening. I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Hiba. Now we are going with the next.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Un gusto estar en el Congreso y un gusto que puedan escuchar pues brevemente a ambos. Tengo ya un buen tiempo de estar colaborando con la profesora Baroud de la Universidad de Vanderbilt y creo que ha sido una experiencia muy buena en cuanto a lo que hemos tratado de desarrollar. Y hoy les voy a contar un poquito de este proyecto nuevo que nosotros tenemos, que queremos desarrollar precisamente para que en Guatemala podamos hacer un estudio o unos estudios como los que ella nos estaba contando hace unos momentos y que se titulan básicamente Estudios de Resiliencia y Sistemas Críticos de Guatemala, en donde vamos a concentrarnos en la parte inicial de nuestro proyecto en la distribución de alimentos durante desastres naturales. Es un proyecto que está comenzando, así que mi presentación, más que contarles mi experiencia, porque pues obviamente tengo mucho menos experiencia en el campo que la profesora Baroud, es que podamos nosotros hacerles una invitación a apoyarnos y contarles un poquito de qué se trata, que creo que es importante para todos nosotros y obviamente para nuestros sistemas críticos en Guatemala. Bien. Entonces, para empezar, ¿de qué se trata el tema de poder yo modelar? Bueno, pues como les presentaba Hiba, el tema de modelar es estar preparado para los desastres, es poder yo predecir qué está sucediendo y dentro de nuestra parte inicial, la idea es que nosotros podamos tomar data histórica, podamos tomar data de lo que está sucediendo o lo que ha sucedido en el pasado en Guatemala, generar nuestros modelos matemáticos y que de esa forma podamos nosotros, como decía Hiba, pues tener algunas herramientas que nos permitan verificar en dónde estamos siendo más vulnerables. Y es que pues ya hay varias herramientas que localmente nos indican lo que ha pasado históricamente. Sin embargo, no tenemos herramientas predictivas. Y esa herramienta predictiva nos puede apoyar muchísimo en, como decía ella, tomar decisiones y en que nuestros actores puedan de alguna manera garantizar los diferentes servicios. Dentro de ellos, nosotros decidimos enfocar este estudio inicialmente en el sistema de distribución de alimentos. ¿Y por qué lo hicimos en el sistema de distribución de alimentos? Bueno, porque definitivamente con la alta susceptibilidad que tenemos, siendo un país en donde la tercera parte se categoriza como en riesgo de seguridad alimentaria y con la gran cantidad de desastres naturales que todos los años nos amenazan, pues bueno, básicamente por eso decidimos irnos por esa línea de primero. Nosotros estamos trabajando con la Universidad de Vanderbilt muy en conjunto, tenemos 4 etapas de trabajo con ellos, que incluyen capacitación con visitas que van a estar haciendo a Guatemala, capacitación nuestra para poder ver lo que ellos han hecho en las instalaciones en Vanderbilt, también en las instalaciones en Houston, y bueno, también trabajar en una red de investigación en Guatemala que pueda ir ligada a la orientación de investigadores para que desarrollen trabajo conjunto en la línea de los sistemas críticos y la resiliencia de los mismos. Nuestro proyecto busca básicamente generar esas herramientas prácticas, como ya les decía, para llevar a la comunidad esa información y poder reaccionar pues previo a que el desastre ocurra, de manera que nosotros tengamos esa forma de que podamos tomar decisiones ágilmente. Además, proporcionar modelos de la distribución a autoridades locales y empresas que podrían aplicar esto para la distribución de alimentos pues originalmente o inicialmente y luego expandirlo hacia otras áreas que se pudieran ir trabajando. Y esto básicamente pues nos va a llevar no solo a generar información pública sobre cómo optimizar estos sistemas, sino también a generar tal vez algunos prototipos que después puedan escalarse y verificar cómo funcionan los modelos. Ejemplo de esto pues ya se ha hecho en Houston, pues la profesora Baroud nos ha trasladado algunos ejemplos de esto, pero en Houston pues básicamente ya se generan este tipo de prototipos de centros de distribución cuando ocurre un desastre y pues se van probando para ver el efecto que puedan llegar a tener, positivo o moderado, digamos, con respecto a la seguridad alimentaria. Y bueno, en Guatemala creo que hace mucho falta esto y podemos desarrollar también ese tipo de prototipos. Y básicamente se planean también trabajos y notas de resultados para poder llevar y dar a conocer el tema pues a la comunidad en general. Tenemos ya el apoyo de 3 instituciones principalmente. Tenemos el apoyo de Conred, Agexport y CESAN, que nos han dado pues ya un compromiso, han expresado para con nosotros su compromiso en proveernos data, algunos, sobre todo Conred, ¿verdad? En poder darnos la información de partida histórica para nosotros poder hacer nuestro modelaje y la parametrización del mismo, a Gexport también para podernos recabar datos sobre las rutas de distribución y logística, porque pues, las compañías logísticas están muy correlacionadas con esta organización. Y pues en la CESAM, más que toda la información de los intereses de actividades en las que se puedan usar los modelos y pues básicamente también integrar parte de los talleres para poder gestionar la información y poder validar nuestros modelos. Esperamos como parte de todo este proceso obtener nuestro modelaje matemático para la simulación de escenarios, las herramientas prácticas que puedan llevarnos a la toma de decisiones efectivas y validar esas decisiones con los participantes o con los tomadores de decisión locales, mejorar los mecanismos de distribución en general del sistema de alimentos, pero bueno, pueden ser aplicables a algunas otras distribuciones. También obtener algunos talleres para compartir y enseñar las metodologías para analizar los sistemas críticos, que creo que es parte donde podemos ir integrando el esfuerzo para que muchos de los que están escuchando puedan integrarse y puedan de alguna manera participar de esta difusión de conocimiento, transferir información a profesionales y estudiantes que estén interesados, que es un esfuerzo que ya se ha empezado y que vamos a seguir haciendo para tratar de que podamos estar más preparados en los desastres y poder colaborar de mejor manera. Como les decía, mi presentación o mi intervención era más que todo para poder contarles de este proyecto nuevo que estamos desarrollando en conjunto con Vanderbilt y las instituciones que les mencioné. Y bueno, básicamente la pregunta con la que terminaría es, ¿les interesa de alguna manera apoyarnos? ¿Te interesa apoyarnos de alguna manera? Bueno, les dejo por acá mi contacto y pues creo una buena forma pues por email para poderme contactar y que podamos de esa manera conversar y poder ampliar cualquier colaboración que se pueda ir haciendo. De mi parte, pues eso es lo que tenía para compartirles.